Author Robert Boyd is this episode's guest. He's the author of Before the Storm, The Formative Years of America's Last Great Band. Robert, welcome to the podcast. So great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
We got to thank our friend Celeste. She's a mutual friend who helped set this interview up.
Absolutely. Love Celeste.
Let's start with the prologue, the perfect setup to this story. It gets into the history of Aberdeen, Washington, and how it's so important to the story of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. In 2006, the journalist Everett True wrote, quote, "Aberdeen feels lethargic. The products in the antique shops sum the place up. Overused, dirty, and neglected." Talk about how Aberdeen helped to, as you write, cultivate the last great American rock band of the 20th century, Nirvana.
Aberdeen is like the Old West in my readings, is so far and away what you would expect an American town to be. And it was somewhat like the Old West, even into the 1950s. There was as I noted in the book, prostitution was big up until the 1950s in Aberdeen, but it became a lawless environment in the late 1800s when timber and the fishing industries were prominent. And that brought in laborers, gambling, prostitution, and it was a ripple effect throughout into the next century. And as that calmed down, and families began to matriculate into the town, unfortunately, there was little left at that point. And that's where Kurt Cobain and his family fall into place. They were there at the end of this great boom.
Chapter 1 gets into Kurt's childhood there. He's quoted as saying he had a happy childhood until he was 8. Always smiling, loved to draw, showed his creativity at an early age. What caused the shift with Kurt after the age of 8?
It's a pretty well-known story with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, his parents' divorce, his early childhood, as it was displayed in a documentary that came out several years ago, Montage of Heck. Just a happy, normal child. In every video that I've seen, pre 9 years old, 8 years old, he's smiling, having a blast. And then his parents divorced when he was 9, and it pulled the rug out from underneath him. From the research that I did, he just wanted a normal, simple family. He craved it. And when that ended, the happy child ended too. And angst followed.
There was a period when Kurt was said to be homeless as a teenager. How much of that was true? Because there's some myth.
Well, I think he was homeless as far as not having a stable home. There's the great story of him sleeping under the bridge. From everything that I've read, that was not the case. He may have spent some time underneath the bridge, but as far as living there, that most likely was not the case. But after his parents divorced, he did go from home to home. He lived with his mother and father multiple times. Obviously, after they had separated, he lived with other family members, friends, even a teacher. But there were also times when he had few options. And as I noted in the book, he slept in hallways of apartments so he could stay warm. So yeah, he was homeless, for lack of a better term, just not having a consistent place to rest his head.
Another interesting story is regarding the very first concert he attended. He would later say it was a Black Flag concert, but that wasn't true. It wasn't Black Flag. And I like this story because I am a fan of Van Halen, so there's a little connection here. What was the first concert he ever went to?
Aberdeen, being the isolated town that it was, there was a little opportunity for Kurt or any teen to really gain a vast musical experience. So his first concert was Sammy Hagar. Years later, he would try to modify history a bit and claim that Black Flag was his first concert, but he and some friends had traveled to Seattle, I believe it was 83, and saw Sammy Hagar, and even sported a T-shirt, from what I understand, after the fact at school.
The Red Rocker. Kurt had a fascination with all things having to do with the human body, so his first band name is really no surprise. Talk about his very first band. Some of the other bands he was in before forming Nirvana, there was a very short-lived Creedence Clearwater Revival tribute band.
Yeah, I was surprised in researching the history because there are a few occasions where Creedence does come up. So he had a very short-lived band called the Sellouts that was with Chris Novoselic and another local who drummed briefly for them, but it was short lived. But his first experience into just aggressive music was a band that he had started with Dale Crover from the Melvins called Fecal Matter. And he made a demo at his aunt's home with Dale Grover, and he was do it yourself from day one. His aunt offered to allow him to use her electric drum kit, and he was against that. He ended up using a empty suitcase for the percussion parts of that particular demo.
And there was a place called The Shack where he wrote music. This is also when his addiction to drugs began. Talk about The Shack and how early did drugs take hold of Kurt?
Again, during his period of homelessness, he had few options, but eventually, as he grew and kind of developed a social scene, he was able to take advantage of living in a home which was basically crumbling, and it was called by Kurt and some of his friends the Shack. And it was in the Shack that he spent a lot of time playing the guitar, but unfortunately also he began to delve in substance use. In high school, he was always into marijuana, alcohol, cutting class to acquire both. But once school ended and living in Aberdeen with few outlets, most of his time was spent under the influence.
And I thought it was interesting because there was a friend of his that was doing heroin, and he was telling his friend, you can't do that stuff. It's going to kill you. And then he ended up himself doing heroin.
That was a surprising story. And from what I understand, he was against heroin for the simple fact that he was fearful of needles. But over time, the interest, and I think too, his mental health played a big role in throwing caution to the wind and eventually experimenting and becoming addicted to heroin.
Yeah, the self-medication. You hear that often too, their fear of needles, but eventually the addiction gets so strong that they're willing to do anything to get that high, and that's what happened. Talk about the names that Kurt and Chris went through before choosing Nirvana. One of them was Skid Row.
Skid Row, I'm drawing a blank.
Is it Pencil, something?
But there were, several names, and even
Pencil Sharpener, was that one of them? I got the book here. We'll check. There was quite a few, from what I recall, that they went through before they settled on Nirvana.
Yeah, and even their first demo in January of '88, they went to Reciprocal Recording, not being Nirvana. They were one of the other names that they eventually threw out in favor of Nirvana, and I think it was in maybe April of '88 that they settled on Nirvana.
Yeah, here it is. Throat Oyster, Pen Cap Chew, that was the one.
Yes.
Window Pane, Ted Ed Fred, Bliss, Skid Row, and then Nirvana. Yeah, he had an interest in Buddhism. So that's Nirvana. That's where Nirvana likely came from, right?
So they say. I've read that in numerous books about his, even though it doesn't come up later on in his life much, but at that point there was an interest in Buddhism, which led to that title for the band that remained in place for the rest of their career.
Yeah, as defined by Webster's, Nirvana is the extinction of desire, passion, illusion, and the empirical self, and attainment of rest, truth, and unchanging being. So the band's first single was Love Buzz. I always thought that was an original. I had no idea that that was a cover, and I listened to the original. It's a band called Shocking Blue.
Yeah, Shocking Blue from the late 60s. It was a single discovered accidentally by Chris Novoselic in Aberdeen, an Aberdeen pawn shop or a dollar bin, and he brought it to Kurt. They modified it a bit, and it ultimately became their first single.
He's got that great bass line, too. It's a great song. This was for Sub Pop Records, which was an independent label, gained fame for signing Seattle bands, with Nirvana being at the top of that list. They released Nirvana's Bleach album, which has Blue, About a Girl, Love Buzz, Negative Creep. Those are really considered classics now in their Nirvana catalog. And About a Girl is interesting. I believe this is the song that there was a Beatles connection, right? This is interesting when you get into Kurt's songwriting. It seemed like he had this internal battle going on where he detested pop culture, yet he couldn't help but embrace the elements of great pop. that he got from listening to the Beatles. And I think you hear it in About a Girl. That's the song, right?
Absolutely. His Aunt Mary kind of introduced him to the Beatles. There's a quote in the book that Kurt felt that he was destined to just listen to the Carpenters and 70s oriented bands such as that throughout the remainder of his life. If it wasn't for his Aunt Mary, she exposed him to the Beatles. And from there, it was a ripple effect. So when he was writing for the Bleach album, every song on the album is rough, sludge, influenced by the Melvins, but About a Girl is a simple pop melody. And from my research, he essentially just listened to the Beatles nonstop and came up with the tone of the song. And it was ultimately the name of the song, title of the song, came from Chad Channing. He said, well, why don't you just call it About a Girl? And Kurt Cobain said, yeah, why not?
Chad Channing, the original drummer.
One of them.
Or one of them, because there was one from Mudhoney that was
there were
there
overall
for
7 drummers.
7.
Wow.
Wow.
When throughout, including Dave Grohl, they went through a series of drummers up until the recording of Bleach, including Dan Peters of Mudhoney.
Summer of 1990, Dan Peters, right? He was in there briefly.
Yep. Kurt Cobain he had become tired of Chad Channing. He wanted a harder drummer, someone who hit harder. They were great friends, and from what I understand, remained great friends, Chris and Kurt, with Chad Channing throughout the remainder of the band. But they just wanted a drummer that hit hard. So in the spring of 1990, Chad was asked to leave the band. And it was at a pivotal time because they had some major label interest. Bleach was selling well. They had just finished a European tour and a North American tour. So Chad left the band and they had few options. So both Dale Crover and Dan Peters stepped in to help out. And Dan Peters of Mudhoney, even though Mudhoney was on hiatus at the time, assumed that he was going to get the role. He was going to be Nirvana's new full-time drummer. But completely coincidentally, Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic attended a Scream show in California. Dave Grohl was the drummer of Scream, a punk band out of Washington, D.C. And soon after that particular show, Scream disbanded. So Dave Grohl, needing a new position, was pointed in the direction of Nirvana. And the rest is history.
There was a live show in June of '89 at Seattle's Moore Theater that really put Nirvana on the map in Seattle among the music community. Can you talk about that show?
In December and January of 88 and 89, Nirvana completed recording of Bleach. Sub Pop had some financial issues and they weren't able to distribute the album as fast as they would have liked. And a June release was planned at that time as well. A June show was planned at the Moore Theater in Seattle, along with Tad and Mudhoney. Nirvana opened that particular show. And at the time, they were known, but not to the extent of Tad or Mudhoney, for that matter as well. But they, from what I understand, put on an unbelievable performance, trashed their gear, and then proceeded to begin the North American leg of the tour into June and July of 89.
Steve Turner was on this podcast. He put out a great book. And I remember him saying the speed at which Nirvana developed into this amazing band. It was almost overnight. It was amazing. They knew this band. Actually, he said he was offered a job as a second guitarist, and he said no because he felt they'd be better off as a three-piece. Did you know that story?
And I didn't, but one of the things that I noted in the book that was very surprising to me when I read it was after Jason Everman left the band, and he was briefly a touring guitarist, Ben Shepherd, Soundgarden's bass player, eventual bass player, he was a roadie, and he was considered as a second guitarist. He wasn't offered the position, but it was an odd story that I had never heard much about before.
Yeah, and I want to revisit the Everman story because he's fascinating too. We'll get to that.
Very.
Yeah. Author Robert Boyd, he's the author of Before the Storm, The Formative Years of America's Last Great Band. Bleach, released in 1989. It's received with critical acclaim, but it's not the commercial hit that would come with the next album, as we know. we're still at the height of the hairband era. A band like Nirvana, they've got a following, but they're not getting radio airplay and MTV and anything like that. But 2 years later, all of those hair bands gone thanks to Nevermind, released under a major label, and Nirvana becomes the biggest band in the world. They signed with Geffen, and I want to ask you how they end up signing with Geffen, but anybody listening to this or watching this that's old enough to recall, I never have seen anything like it before or since, an album blow up like that. And I think you're around the same age as me. I was in college. This is fall of 91, and I remember my roommate had Nevermind. The single Smells Like Teen Spirit had just come out. He was really into like a lot of the alternative bands. He was a big Jane's Addiction fan. So he was a little bit more in the know on it. So I remember looking at it, I was like, who is this? You got to hear it. And, really it was like within a month or two, they were huge. When did you first hear Smells Like Teen Spirit? And I mean, did you experience the same thing? Because that was just mind blowing.
I'm actually younger.
Okay.
I was only in my early teens at the time. In '92, after the album was released, is when I really experienced the pull of Nevermind.
So they were big by the time you first heard, but you must have heard then. All your friends at school, you got to listen to them. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I was pulled in immediately when I wrote this book and picked the title of the book. I tried to put it word out through social media, and people were like, "The Last Great Band." Like people like questioned that title,
sure. Yeah.
And I understand that. I completely understand that.
Yeah,
but it's based on the impact culturally that you don't see anywhere since the '90s. There has been no band that I know of that has had such an impact in so many ways, clothing, culturally, in so many factors as Nirvana. That is why I picked that particular title. The music, of course, is incredible, but the impact, it hasn't been seen since.
There's a great story. I just looked it up, September 26, 1991. Nirvana, still unknown at that time. I think they just released Smells Like Teen Spirit. I was going to college at Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven, and they played
At the Moon.
At the Moon, and it's on YouTube. There's like 50 people there, maybe 100. It was right down the road from where the dorm I was in. This is pre-internet. Had no idea. So maybe there was an ad in the paper or whatever, but that place is now a bank, I think. And it's on Dixwell Ave in New Haven. It's mind-blowing to watch that because you're seeing a band playing in this little tiny club. I mean, barely, like Chris's head is almost hitting the ceiling. It's so small. 2 months later, they're
gigantic. Throughout that entire
It's amazing
tour,
to watch.
Yeah, throughout that entire tour, in September, late September and early October, their video was number one on MTV. They're selling hundreds of thousands of albums, and they're playing in clubs the size of a basement. And they're in October, and the story's in the book and in multiple books. October, they played in Texas, and the club is just jam-packed. I mean, you couldn't fit another body in. It was at that particular show that Kurt decides to crowd surf, and he gets into an altercation with a bouncer. It's a pretty well-known clip, but that was how that tour was. It was just a sweaty mess of bodies at every stop.
And Geffen didn't even think it was going to be, I don't know, I think they had an estimated sales number, so they could not keep enough of these CDs in the record stores. They said they maybe expected like 50,000 copies or something like that.
There were about 100,000 copies printed, both between the UK and US. So there was a period of time after Nevermind was released and Smells Like Teen Spirit, the video was playing every 15 minutes practically on MTV, that Geffen suspended pressings on albums except Nevermind. They had to catch up. And in the UK, there were so few copies available, if any. People were just making tapes, trading tapes amongst themselves until the album became available once again.
And the absolute switch there, you had bands that were playing in arenas, selling out arenas, now playing in tiny little clubs that Nirvana started out playing. And then Nirvana's now playing in the huge arenas. How did they sign with Geffen?
So Sub Pop wanted them for a second album, and they had presented the band with a much lengthier contract than their first. Their first contract was one page, fill in the blanks, and they presented a new contract, 30 pages long. But they wanted to, particularly Kurt Cobain wanted a major label. He wanted to be a rock star. Despite all the stories, he wanted that adulation. And there were several major labels that were courting Nirvana. And actually, after I had released this book, I had corresponded with a former employee of MCA who tried to sign Nirvana to MCA, and he was very close. But ultimately, Geffen won out, and the dollar amount that Nirvana signed for was not substantial. But one caveat within the contract was if they sold more than 500,000 copies, they would earn millions. They must have been clairvoyant or something because they sold 20 times that over time.
Let's go back to Jason Everman. I love this story. So he was in the band as the second guitarist at one point. Didn't last long. Apparently, Kurt thought he was too much of a showman. He eventually goes on to a career in the military. So what happened? How long was he in the band? That's the, I believe that's in your book too. He was too much of a showman, right?
Yeah, so he financed Bleach. Bleach cost a little over $600, multiple days at reciprocal recording, and he financed that. After he had kind of entered Nirvana's universe, Kurt thought, well, we could use a guitarist for touring, and he fit the bill. They didn't really know him well. Chad Channing did know him because they both were from Bainbridge Island, but Chris and Kurt did not know him. They quickly learned that their personalities did not mesh once the tour began in the summer of '89. So they played throughout June and July, made it to New York, and Kurt and Chris had actually had the plan to just leave him there. They didn't want him in the band. They wanted to just flee in the night, and they thought better of it.
Yeah.
But they canceled the remainder of the tour. They just could not deal with Jason Everman anymore. And I've seen some of the footage from shows from that summer, and he is very animated on stage.
Really? Is that on YouTube?
Yeah, a lot of headbanging, I guess.
Yeah.
He's a metal guy. There's a few shows from that particular tour. There's one show where he actually dives off the stage. It might have been in New Jersey, and he assaults someone in the crowd. So it was those type of things that they didn't fit with the Nirvana that everyone knows and would eventually know.
And he's on
So
one track, or isn't he on one of the live albums?
they added a track to a Kiss compilation, and he played on that particular song that was on that compilation, like a benefit for Kiss that
Yeah,
was
they did.
released in '89. So Everman, soon after he left Nirvana, landed in Soundgarden. Their bassist quit suddenly. I believe it was mid tour or right before a tour. So they took Jason Everman on, and he had the same trouble with Soundgarden that he had with Nirvana. Just personalities did not mesh. He lasted just a few months. He was out of Soundgarden and had very few options. He eventually made his way to New York and picked up some various jobs. I believe he worked in a factory. He was a bike messenger, but he eventually enlisted in the military, and he joined special forces, did a tour in Iraq, a tour in Afghanistan, and was honorably discharged. So he has had an incredible life, and in recent years has done sailing for benefits around the world, at least throughout the Pacific Ocean. So he has done a lot.
It's a great story. By the way, it's Do You Love Me? That was the Kiss song they covered.
Yes.
Nevermind released September of 91. Smells Like Teen Spirit released ahead of the album, August of 91. By the fall, the album's picking up serious steam, and it's interesting to read about how Kurt's relationship with Courtney Love was advancing at a rapid pace, like right at the same time, and Nevermind is doing the same. How did Kurt and Courtney meet, and was it instant chemistry?
I think Courtney thought it was. She was beginning her own band, Hole. Hole began playing some of the same shows as Nirvana, and Courtney quickly gravitated towards Kurt. Between the release of Nevermind and the end of the year, they became inseparable. It was within that time period that she became pregnant, and by February of 92, they were married. She had been in Nirvana's world for some time, but it was in the summer of 91, fall of 91, that she really made her presence known, and things happened quickly.
She moved around the country quite a bit. So at that time, she was living in Seattle when she met him.
I believe she was living in California, but she had been all over the map
Yeah.
at that point in her life. Their lives were very similar. They had a toxic relationship, but they were very similar people in that they came from broken homes. They struggled with addiction, antisocial personalities, but where Courtney was very animated, Kurt was far from that. And I think that's what eventually created some strain in their relationship and Nirvana as a whole.
She lived in the UK for a while, and this is a wild. So her father was a roadie for the Grateful Dead. You can see her on the back of one of Grateful Dead's albums. There's a picture of all of the family of Grateful Dead members, and Courtney Love's there, little baby. You know about that?
Yeah,
I'm sure, right?
yeah. In the late '90s, there was a documentary that was released called Kurt and Courtney. It was controversial, and her father's interviewed in the documentary,
Yeah, they
and
did not get
he
along.
no, no, not at all. And I don't think they ever mended their relationship.
He just
Um,
passed away like a year or two ago, right?
yeah,
Yeah, it's the album. God, I always try pronouncing this one. Eoxo Moxoa. That's the Grateful Dead album. And I think it's on the inside sleeve or on the back is where you can see Courtney Love as a little kid. What was the recording process like for Nevermind? Because you write about a couple of interesting things in the book. They always had to have a jam session before recording. And Kurt, this is fascinating, didn't come up with lyrics to a lot of the songs until the last minute. But it start with the jam session, right? That was a thing that there was a routine for them.
yeah. They really thrived during jam sessions. They typically would begin sessions or practices in general jamming, and a lot of songs, the infancy of songs, began during those jams. The album was recorded in California, in Los Angeles, and they spent less than a month recording the album, and typically would spend an entire afternoon recording, jamming, recording, and then leaving the studio and heading down to Venice Beach. Chris Novoselic later said that, it was some of the best times of his life because things obviously got pretty crazy soon after.
You talk about a great movie idea. That would be a great movie. That period of time before they blow up, what that was like for the guys. Because yeah, I remember Chris talking about that. Just that was like a time of innocence. They still had aspirations. Obviously, Kurt, like you said, he wanted to break into the big time, but certainly didn't expect it to be as huge as it became, and really too much for him to handle. Too much for anybody to handle, really. That kind of fame, it really was. But that short period of time there where it was just them and the music, I would love to see a movie on that. And as popular as Nevermind is, the story of the follow-up and sadly last Nirvana studio album, In Utero from 93, that may be even more interesting because here now Kurt's trying to get rid of all these fans that, like he used to say, like he'd be looking out in the audience and he'd see the guy who was the quarterback of the football team wearing his letter jacket. It's like, this is the guy that would beat the shit out of me in high school. Now he's my fan. Now he's my number one fan. It's bizarre. So he wanted to distance himself from that. It still didn't work though, because people ended up buying that album in droves,
Oh, absolutely. Chris
Yeah.
Novoselic described it as a litmus test for their fans. They wanted the pure Nirvana fan. Within Utero, they wanted to distance themselves from the fake listener. I think In Utero is their masterpiece. It hits all the areas for me, all the buttons. It's just amazing. And to think that they made that album in such a time of turmoil, it's amazing.
What's that lyric in the opening track? Serve the servants, teenage angst. What's
Teenage angst has paid off well. Now I'm bored and old.
wow? I mean, that's the first. I think
Yeah.
that's the literally the first line in the entire
First
album.
line,
Yeah,
first
yeah,
line of the album.
yeah. Talk about where it was recorded because it was chosen specifically to keep the press away, and also the producer, who sadly just passed away, Steve Albini, took a flat fee.
So again, they wanted to distance themselves from the fake fan. They picked Steve Albini as the producer because he could get that hard sound while sounding pure at the same time. He took a flat fee. He was definitely a man of principle, even though it's a sizable sum. I believe he took $100,000. It might have been more, but he lost millions in royalties. They picked Pachyderm Studios in. Now you're really testing my memory.
Oh, I can look it
I,
up.
I forget the town, but
It's
Pachyderm was in the middle of nowhere.
oh,
Again,
here
they
we go.
specifically
Yeah. Oh, Minnesota, Cannon Falls,
Minnesota.
Minnesota. Yeah.
So it was February in Minnesota, snow everywhere. Pachyderm was a studio, but it had living quarters. So they spent 2 weeks together with Albini and another engineer. Courtney eventually showed up as well. They picked this isolated area for a number of reasons to distance themselves from the press, but also, unfortunately, to limit Kurt's risk of relapse. He was at a time where his addiction was really out of control. I don't know if they were successful in limiting his use in that environment, but everything that I've read about those 2 weeks, approximate 2 weeks in at Pachyderm, it was a great time. I would love to see some footage. There's very little. There's some photos, but every photo they're smiling, having a blast. It's really crazy again to think of the turmoil going on with them in their private lives as a band, but during those 2 weeks they just pulled it all together and made a epic masterpiece.
Yeah, and they're in the middle of nowhere. So now I'm thinking. Now, speaking of photos, there's that photo of Kurt where he's wearing a hat. It's like somebody out of the movie Fargo. It's like it's a winter hat. Is that what? Because he was in Minnesota, was he wearing it there?
I'm not
Do you know
familiar
the
with
one I'm
that
talking
photo.
about? Okay, I gotta maybe I'll send it to you by email so you can. But I don't even know what you call it. But like the movie
Yeah.
Fargo, where like the flaps come down and cover the ears, and it's like a big wool thing on top, or it almost looks like a raccoon
Elmer
died on the
Fudd.
top of his head. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I wonder if that's what that's where it came from. Oh, the other thing is funny is the name that Steve Albini had, the nickname for Courtney Love,
The
the
Psycho Hose Beast. Yeah.
Psycho. Now, why did he call her that?
Well, those are two very strong personalities, Albini and Courtney Love. It was completely expected that they would butt heads. He wanted an environment of stability to make a good band. Again, he was a man of principle and he did not want the drama. And that's all Courtney brought was drama.
Love to get some film footage of that going down. Steve
Oh
Albini,
yeah.
get the hell out of here. Yeah, April 8th, 1994, the news that Kurt Cobain was dead. I remember where I was. Where were you when you heard the news of his suicide, and what went through your mind when you heard it?
Again, I was still a teenager at the time, but it was hugely impactful. That was my band. Like the Beatles to others, and how John Lennon's death was impactful. Freddie Mercury's death was impactful for Queen fans. I was a Nirvana fan. I was hugely impacted. The music industry changed. It was never the same. And there were bands that came along, obviously influenced by Nirvana, Silverchair, Bush, all those '90s alternative
Silverchair,
post
yeah.
post grunge bands, but the uniqueness of Nirvana, it was rare. It became rare, scarce, and hasn't been seen much since.
Yeah, it was just genuine, and I never heard anything with a mix of raw just the sound overall production of it raw, the sound of the guitars raw, but yet undeniably catchy, I guess, for lack of a better word. But it's something you go back to again and again and again. It's like I was just telling you before we started recording. I was listening to a bunch of Nirvana this morning on my way to work, a bunch of Nirvana on my way home from work, and just all of these songs that I know instantly. I know the lyrics and the riffs. I think Kurt's underrated as a guitarist. I know those who are fans of the '80s guitar, and I'm a Van Halen fan, so I'm a fan of those guitarists that technically, technically proficient, but the riffs that he came up with, the melodies, the way he constructed a song, this is like nothing I ever heard before or since.
I've heard Nirvana described as basically a mix of Black Sabbath and the Beatles, and I think that
Yeah,
that's pretty accurate.
that is.
It's just a perfect combination of pop, metal, sludge, everything.
If you're of a certain age, like I was 19, 20, you were a teenager at the time, you got that angst in you, the frustration of being a teenager and late teens, early 20s. It was like that, just the sound of it too. Cause there was the funny thing is like, what is he saying? Like Smells Like Teen Spirit. My brother had the cassette single and it had the lyrics on it. So then you could actually read it because nobody knew what the hell he was saying.
Yeah,
But you didn't even need to know what he was saying really just to feel what was coming out of him. Like you could connect with that frustration and the angst that he was feeling. A lot of people felt, and a lot of people that I was one of them. You're not the most popular kid. Kurt was that guy like you could relate to that. He just kind of championed that whole movement. He would be 58. I mean, that's what's crazy. This February, he'd be 58. And you give some statistics in the book that show just how popular they still are. 30 million listeners per month on Spotify. 4 of the top 10 songs played on mainstream rock radio are from Nirvana. Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, In Bloom, and Lithium, all from Nevermind. 75 million albums sold worldwide. And you know what's another cool thing? Like with Smells Like Teen Spirit, so he was taking from the music that was like that the Smells Like Teen Spirit riff. He even said it's more than a feeling from Boston. So he's taking these riffs and creating something completely unique. It sounds nothing like anything that came before it. Now there was, I mean, punk rock had already been there and all that. I get that, but there was just this combination again, like that's perfect. Black Sabbath and the Beatles. What do you think he'd be doing today if he was still with us? Would he have just gone solo, come back to Nirvana? Because I think about this all the time. It's like Hendrix. He just was not around long enough. 27 years old.
I think Nirvana was on their way out in the spring of '94. In hindsight, there was just so much turmoil, largely because of his addiction. The last time he and Chris Novoselic ever saw each other was in the Seattle airport.
Right.
Chris was driving, making an attempt to get him into rehab, and they had a vicious argument, and that was the last time he saw him. I think that just speaks to just the turmoil, the craziness in the Nirvana universe. And I think Kurt made it pretty clear in a number of ways that he wanted to try new things. He had gotten very close with Michael Stipe in '94, and there was some discussion about the two of them recording together. So I think he would have gravitated towards like a folk acoustic solo career, but we'll never know.
I think that too, but I also wonder, enough time passed, would he have gotten back with the guys and did another run with Nirvana? Because I think he would have. But if he
He
had enough time away from all that craziness, give it another like 10 years, and 2004 we get the Nirvana reunion. I mean, that would
he
have been
and
so
Chris
wild.
Novoselic had a genuine brotherhood. Like
Yeah,
um, all the footage I've seen, they they had something special. Dave was a perfect addition to Nirvana and was one of the guys, but it was Chris and Kurt's band. When I watch interviews with Chris Novoselic over time since Kurt passed, like he's not the same.
mm.
Like it had such an impact on him. He's a different person.
He left music entirely. He got into politics, didn't he?
He's a huge into politics.
Yeah.
He tried some musical ventures, but obviously nothing would compete with where he had been.
Thankfully, there's four studio albums, right? Because there's Bleach, Incesticide.
Incesticide was a compilation album.
Yeah.
That was from 87 to 92. That was every studio session, rarities, B-sides. That was put together in December of 92 to basically
Capitalize on
um,
their.
capitalize, keep the audience at bay until a proper studio album could come out, which was eventually in utero.
Another great live album is From the Banks of Muddy Wishka. That's a great live album.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before the Storm, The Formative Years of America's Last Great Band. It's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. And where can people find you online, Robert?
Well, I do have an Instagram page dedicated to this book, but also just as a basically a celebration of the band. I use the account to get the book out there, but I also use it to just kind of celebrate the impact Nirvana had. It's Nirvana underscore before underscore the underscore storm.
Put a link in the show notes. If there was one song that you would choose to introduce somebody to Nirvana that never listened to them before, that would be like the perfect gateway song, what would it be?
I've always been a sucker for Dive. It's on
Oh,
Incesticide.
yes.
Um, and it's perfect. It's just I never get tired of it. Lithium as well, but everyone knows Lithium. But Dive to me is just it just picks me up every time I hear it.
Robert Boyd, thanks, man.
Thank you very much.